Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to do a colored pencil drawing of this bird. It's a cardinal or red bird, and it's a winter scene with a bit of snow. So let's start. The reference is going to be included in the description if you want to examine it a little bit. I'm going to do a freehand sketch first, and I'm going to try to adjust the position of the branches so that it kind of fits into my composition a little bit. As for the shape of the bird, I'm going to try to get that to look as close as possible to the original. And the first thing I did before I started the sketch was to determine roughly what the size or the height of the bird will be. And then I started drawing some of the smaller details such as the beak, the crest, then the middle part of the body, and then the tail. And then I'm going to draw all of these branches. Now, as for the pencils I'm using, because you're going to want to know that as well, I'm using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. No, I'm not going to use all of the ones that I have here on my desk, but I'm going to use most of them, I suppose. Now I'm drawing all of these branches, and I'm going to sketch out the shape of the branches using a walnut brown for starters, but then later I'll be adding some other colors to it. Now, as for the reddish tones on the bird itself, I'm going to use a number of different reds. For the base colors, I'm going to use the cadmium red, which has a bit of an orangey component to it, because that's the way the bird looks to me in the reference. It looks like a warmer, slightly more orangey red, I suppose. And in addition to that, I will use a bit of scarlet red, which is similar, but a bit more reddish, I suppose. And then I'm going to use a couple of different darker reds. Now, here I'm adding a bit of darker warm gray to the background. The reason why I'm doing that is because I want to create an out of focus background with some suggestions of shapes in the distance. The thing is that it's a blurry bokeh background, and you don't want to have any details there, but you still want to have a background, and you want to be able to kind of try to create some suggestions of where the scene takes place and some suggestions of depth and distance in it. So I'm going to use a bit of that warm grey, but I also added a touch of this darker olive green on top of that to include a bit of those greenish tones. And after that I did some blending with a Q-tip, because when you apply colored pencils lightly, you can actually blend them pretty easily with a Q-tip. The paper I'm working on is Fabriano toned paper called Clay. It's like a light warm grey color, and it's going to be perfect for the type of scene that I'm trying to create. But let me just say a few more words about this out of focus background that I'm trying to create. I just created some patches of slightly darker value, which are grayish with a little bit of green in them. And the reason why I added a bit of green, which you maybe can't really see in the reference, is because I thought that with the green being a complementary color to the red, that will enhance the contrast and maybe bring out the main subject. Now I'm moving on to this snow, because you can see that there is a little bit of snow on these branches, so I'm going to put that in using a white colored pencil. And I'm already achieving a nice bit of contrast between those lighter snowy details and the grayish background of my toned paper. But I have a trick that I'm going to use later, which will even enhance this contrast even more a little bit later, but I'll get to that much later in the drawing process. Right now I just want to put in those lighter details, and you can see how I'm drawing these small irregular shapes, irregular edges, to make it look like real snow, and just throwing a few bits of those white specks here and there just to show that the snow is covering a rough surface of those branches and twigs. And here it's time to move on to the main subject being the bird, and it's a red bird with a little bit of black and orange here and there. So for the black area here, and the eye itself is black, and there's also a patch of darker black feathers, or they appear black to me, around the eyes and around the beak. So it's a very interesting contrast. So it's going to make for a very nice contrast with the red feathers. But as for the eye, I drew that catchlight in the eye using the white colored pencil. So I put in a tiny white circle, and then I worked around it with a black colored pencil, and that's going to make for a really nice contrast as well. The rest of the eye was done with warm grey, and of course mostly with a black colored pencil. Now I'm going to move on to the feathers and the crest, and here I'm going to have to use some more of those darker reds. So I told you already, for the base color I'm going to use the cadmium red in a combination with the scarlet red, because those are the ones that looked close to the colors I saw in the reference. Of course, you don't really have to worry about creating the exact same colors that you see in the reference. Just try to approximate and it should be fine. And the same goes with the shape of the animal, to be honest, because when you're drawing portraits you have to be a little bit more careful about the proportions, but here when you're drawing birds and animals you can just use freehand, and if you're reasonably close to the shape and the proportions of the animal, it's probably going to be fine. Nobody's going to notice. Anyway, for the darker reddish tones, I used an Indian red and the what was the other one? I'm not really sure, but let me just check for a second. So I used the Indian red and the middle cadmium red. The middle cadmium red is a lot darker than the reds that I used for the base color. So this is important because you want to have that range of value, because without the range of value your subject is just going to end up looking flat, and I don't want it to look flat. I want it to look three-dimensional, and in order to make it look three-dimensional I need to establish that range of value from the darker shadow areas to the lighter areas. And when you have that, that kind of helps you explain the volume or the shape of the animal or the bird, whatever subject you're trying to draw. And it helps to make everything look more realistic and more three-dimensional. It also helps you add more texture to imitate the appearance of those feathers. Now, feathers are interesting to draw. Normally I don't really like drawing feathers because they can get pretty complex, and that usually takes quite a bit of patience. But when you're drawing a smaller bird like this, and when it's not really a close-up of a bird, it's actually quite a bit simpler. And the reason why it's simpler is because most of these tiny feathers almost kind of look like short fur on a furry animal, and I'm going to draw them in a similar fashion just by drawing these short marks that kind of look like fur, but they're actually really small feathers. And you see that there is an area of lighter feathers here on the chest. They're kind of ruffled feathers that maybe were lifted up by the wind or whatever. So these are going to appear lighter because they're sticking out, and the area behind them, which is more tucked in, is going to appear darker. So I'm working there with some darker values, darker pencils such as the brown and even the black colored pencil. So the idea is to divide those larger groups of feathers into smaller shapes. And also another thing that you have to pay attention to is the shape and the size of the feathers, because the length of the feathers is not going to be the same depending on the part of the body. So here on the wings, for example, which is what I've just done, the feathers are actually quite a bit longer, and also on the tail, but I'll get to the tail a bit later. But you can see how just by using these considerably darker pencils, I'm able to achieve a much more three-dimensional look, and that's very, very important. Now if you compare this to my reference, you will see that there are some much lighter details which I'm omitting at the moment. I'll get to those later, near the end of the drawing process, because like I said, I have a little trick that I'm going to apply a bit later, and the trick will involve using a primer or clear gesso. You know, if you've been watching my videos, especially colored pencil drawings, you know that I like to work on sanded surfaces. So I started this one out working on regular paper. This paper is a toned paper, but it's a regular surface, it's non-sanded. But I'm going to add a primer to it later. So this is a bit of an unconventional approach, but I think it will work, and I think you will like the results. By the way, here I'm just sort of refining the appearance of the feathers by adding some of those shadow areas in between the smaller groups of feathers, basically trying to add more depth to that coat of feathers and make it look more three-dimensional. Now at one point I realized that some of those darker areas in the background started to appear too flat once I've started adding those darker values on my main subject. That's called value interaction. Something can appear dark enough, but when you put something else much darker on the paper, those lighter values just sort of start to disappear. So I decided to add more value to those darker elements in the background, and I simply added a bit more of that warm grey and a bit more of that darker olive green. And like I said, these are just some suggestions of shapes in the distance, and I want them to look blurry. I want to avoid textures, which is why I always blend with a Q-tip. Normally colored pencils are not that easy to blend, but when you apply them lightly without much pressure, and you don't push or bury the pigment into the paper by holding the pencil perpendicular to the paper, you're going to be able to blend a little bit with brushes and Q-tips and things like that. And these Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils are generally a little bit harder, so even more difficult to blend. But for these lighter areas, it works. So I'm just proceeding to refine the details on the bird itself, adding some of these smaller feathers and adding a bit more shape and a little bit more shading to that chest and belly area, so that I could convey that round shape to the viewer. I want to draw the texture of the feathers and shape the feathers in such a manner to explain to the viewer that they are looking at a round bulging surface, which is that chest area of the bird. And some of those feathers are kind of covering the branch that the bird is sitting on. But I'm going to get back to that a bit later. Right now I want to do a little bit more work on the branches, and for that, like I said, I'm going to use a brown colored pencil first, and then I'm going to see if I can add some more details and colors to it. But the brown is doing a pretty good job for now, because I'm not going to cover it very thoroughly. I want it to leave a little bit of texture there. I want it to look a little bit rough, like it's a surface of a surface of a wood, of those branches. And also I have to pay attention to the shape of the branches, so I want to have them growing kind of every which way, changing direction almost unpredictably, and tapering as they grow out. Some of them are a little bit thinner, Some of them are a little bit thicker, and I want to have a whole bunch of them. And of course, on one of the lower ones, the bird will be perched, but I'll get to that a bit later. You may notice that I also added a touch of black colored pencil to these branches, and I also added a little bit of green. So I wanted to introduce some greenish and some darker tones, black colored pencil. I also left some parts of those branches kind of bare to make it look like maybe the tree bark is damaged in those areas, just to have a little bit more variation. So, and also I want to have some of these patches of snow kind of separated from the rest. So like maybe some of the snow had fallen off or melted off. I don't know, just a little bit of variation to make things a bit more interesting to the viewer. This lower branch here, where the bird is perched and where its legs are resting, that was a little bit confusing for me, because I couldn't really make out which part of that scene was the branches and twigs and which were the legs, because it has such tiny legs, and because they're mostly hidden by the body and the feathers. So I just sort of followed the shapes that I saw in the reference and tried to do the best that I could. And after that, I just went on to finish the rest of these branches, and of course cover them with a little bit of snow using a white colored pencil. So I guess you could say that I used about a dozen, or maybe a little bit less, maybe around 10 pencils so far. Another thing that you may notice is that I've used 2 black colored pencils. I have the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, but I also like to use the Cardinal silky black pencil, which is a little bit darker in my opinion, so that gives you a little bit of extra range of value when you want to add those pitch black or really dark areas. So here I'm still working a little bit on the background, adding a few touches of darker value and doing a little bit more blending, just to make sure that I have some variation in value in the background so that it looks more interesting, and that I also have a little bit more of that green in the background, because as I was adding more and more details to the main subject, which is obviously red, I realized the importance of adding those touches of green to the background to emphasize that contrast by introducing the complementary color, which is green. I also need to add a little bit more shadow around those snowy white parts so that I would really make them stand out. That's why I made the feathers above them a little bit darker, because that will enhance the contrast between those lighter snowy bits and the bird itself, and it will make the scene look more three-dimensional, and it will make it look like those branches covered with snow are really in front of the bird. And then I moved on to the tail. The tail turned out to be a little bit more complex than I expected. It seems very simple with a few of these longer feathers, but the trick was to define the way in which they overlap, which is why you have to separate the tail into smaller shapes and then kind of shade in between them, defining the shadow areas in between those larger overlapping shadows and the feathers which are sticking out and are therefore lighter. I'm adding a little bit more green at the bottom, like I did in the upper part of the background, and blending that with a Q-tip because it seems to work pretty well. And I'm also going to make some minor adjustments on the body of the bird, adding a few of those darker areas in between the groups of feathers just to add a little more depth here and there. Now comes the trick that I was talking about. I'm going to apply clear gesso on top of this paper, and the clear gesso I'm going to use is Liquitex. Liquitex Clear Gesso is a primer, acrylic primer, which will create a textured surface similar to sandpaper, similar to sanded papers used for pastel drawings and paintings. And what that will allow me to do is add more layers and more details, because as you probably know if you work with colored pencils, it's very difficult to add lighter details on top of the darker layers, but on sanded paper you can do that. So I'm just applying a tiny bit of clear gesso at the time, spreading it evenly with a soft synthetic brush. You can see how I'm putting down a very thin layer, pulling it in different directions just to distribute it very, very evenly. Now, you may be worried that I'm going to smudge things. It won't smudge, because when you apply regular, when you apply colored pencil on regular paper, it sticks to the paper, whether it's a wax-based colored pencil or an oil-based colored pencil. It won't smudge that much, to be honest, and even if it does smudge a little bit here and there, it's not a big deal, because I can always go over it, I can always work over it and refine those details because of the tooth that I'm going to get with this surface. So I'm just going back and forth, left and right, in all the directions, spreading that clear gesso very evenly. Another thing that you may be worried about is that this layer of gesso is going to modify the colors. It looks white when you apply it, but it's actually transparent. So when it dries, it will dry clear. It will dry completely clear unless you've applied it very thick. But it'll still mostly be transparent. But I'm using a very, very thin layer, and the amount of tooth that I'll get with it will be more than enough, trust me. So I'm just going bit by bit, working on one portion of the paper at a time, taking my time and just pulling it in different directions to distribute it very evenly, because I want a nice even tooth without huge lumps and streaks and things like that. Normally when I work in colored pencil, if you've been watching my videos, I apply the clear gesso first and then I work with colored pencil. But here I chose a slightly different approach. I knew that I could do most of the work on regular paper, but I wanted some of those tiny fine details. At the end I knew I needed some extra tooth for those, and that's what I'm going to do now. By the way, you have to let this dry once you apply it, and I'm going to leave it overnight because it takes a while for it to completely dry and harden and give you that really nice tooth that'll grab onto the pencil and allow you to put in those extra layers. Also, don't worry about the paper being wavy. It'll relax and straighten out eventually. Alright, so now the paper is ready for the final details, for the final layers. And I picked up this light beige pencil for some of the lighter details on the beak. And I'm going to apply the same pencil on the feathers here, because here the feathers appear a little bit ruffled. They appear to be flying away a little bit because of the wind or whatever. And they're sticking out and catching more light from the light source, so they're a little bit lighter. And you can see how easily I'm able to put in those lighter details, almost as though I were working with pastel pencils rather than colored pencils. It's very easy and you can hear that sound. That's the tooth of the paper. That scratchy sound, it's like working on sanded paper. That's what's allowing me to add these tiny details, these lighter marks on top of the darker layers. On regular paper you could never do that. You could never get such clean marks. And this is the advantage of sanded paper when working with colored pencils. So normally, like I said, you would either work on sanded paper or you would apply clear gesso to create sanded paper first. But here I first did the drawing and then decided to add these final details once the clear gesso was applied. And you can see how by adding these lighter details, it's making everything look not only more detailed and more textured, but also more three-dimensional. I can also go over these darker details with this silky black pencil to make it even darker, to create more depth and make everything look more lively and make the colors look more vibrant. There is more contrast now, there is a greater range of value. Everything will appear a little bit more three-dimensional. But like I said, the main advantage of the tooth is that it allows you to put lighter details on top of the darker layers. You can see now how these lighter patches of color where the snow is on the branches, they're getting even lighter as the tooth allows me to work with a white colored pencil, because on sanded paper colored pencils look a lot more vibrant. The marks you put down are a lot stronger. The colors are a lot more vibrant than they are on regular paper. Well, maybe not a lot more vibrant, but definitely more vibrant and stronger than on regular paper. So you can see how much they stand out against the background. And once I've done most of the work on the snow and the background, I'm going back to refining the bird. There's just a little bit more work to be done, because you see these are just finishing touches. 95% of the work I think was done before I applied clear gesso. But these finishing touches are so important because they will add some really extra realistic detail that I wouldn't be able to achieve otherwise just by working on regular paper. I also added some touches of black colored pencil on those branches to make them appear more three-dimensional, to add some of these darker shadow areas to them, and to add a little bit of that random unpredictable texture here and there, because it should look like a texture of branches, of the texture of wood. And I'm just finishing these details on the snow on some of these lower branches, lower hanging branches. And I'm going to add a few more details to the feathers here and there, again using that light beige pencil. And then as a final touch on the right side, I'm going to add a little bit more of this darker red, Indian red pencil, just to make the bird pop out of the background a little bit more, to increase that contrast between the main subject and the background. So now the drawing is really almost done, and I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower right corner. And I hope you enjoyed the drawing process and found it useful. I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos. Don't forget to give me a like and subscribe, maybe, if you like. Comment, let me know what you think. For longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. Bye for now.